Our topic is going to be the rise and fall of Jim Crow. Jim Crow showed his ugly head a few years ago, and I know everybody have heard the term Jim Crow at one time or another. At least most of us black people have. And the fact of the matter is, African Americans who were born after 1966 never had the chance to meet Jim Crow. And lucky for them, because Jim Crow was not a nice person. And some of you may say, well, exactly what is Jim Crow? And who are they talking about? Because it's a name. It's a name, personification that was invented by white minstrel show actors in the early 1800s. This name soon became synonymous with the segregation and inequality and racism that was mainly pushed in the South, but was felt over the entire United States of America. Now, at the end of slavery, black people, after the signing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were given the exact same rights as whites by the Constitution. But during the Reconstruction period, and the Reconstruction period was from 1866 until about 1766. So you had about a 10-year period that the country was reconstructing after the Civil War. But during that 10-year period, African Americans, some, not all, got educated, became politicians, became mayors of towns, became businessmen, opened up schools. A lot of your historically black colleges was founded. So in other words, they're on their way to becoming regular American citizens with rights that was respected by the government at large, but not so fast. Because they had these rights during Reconstruction, the white Democrats of the South, where blacks mainly were, the vast majority of African Americans were in the South. And surprisingly, the vast majority of African Americans in 2025 are still in the South. But those radical, racist, segregationist Democrats came back into power because, during the Civil War, all those politicians from the South were eliminated because the North had won the war. All the politicians, all the senators from all those southern states, all the congressmen from all those southern states, they were outcast and they was outlawed. But Andrew Jackson, the president, who became president after Abraham Lincoln, he began to slowly let these people get back into power. And when they got back into power, they began to create laws that was first called black codes. And these black codes was just like, I give you a perfect example. A black code was, well, a black man can't own any land in this town, or a black man can't work on this job in this town. They would actually make a code, and everybody white in those areas went along with those codes. And so the black codes continued to grow. You couldn't have a church. You couldn't go to this school. You couldn't come to this restaurant. You couldn't do anything without being segregated or without being discriminated against. Because what they were unofficially trying to do is have black people in a slavery type situation. Okay. They wanted to put you back into a slavery type situation where you relied on them for your livelihood, where you had no independence, where you couldn't make an economic life for yourself, where you couldn't own anything. But these laws, these codes became laws. These segregation laws were passed by the state and local leaders that enforced racial segregation in the United States, mainly in the South. These laws were enacted in the late 1800s and the early 1900s by Southern Democrats. And I want you guys to pause for a minute. And when I say Democrats, I'm talking about the same party that we vote for today. That's what I'm talking about. Democrats. Democrats were the ones who originally came up with the Jim Crow laws. Democrats dominated the state legislature in almost every southern state to disfranchise and remove political and economic gains made by black people during that Reconstruction period. They wanted to keep you poor and hungry with your hand out begging. Does that sound kind of familiar to you today? Where they want to continue to have you asking them to give them things. Now, Jim Crow, the term Jim Crow was not always used originally, but Jim Crow was used in 1892 in a New York publication for the very first time. It appeared as a title at the top of the fold in the newspaper. And it was talking about the article was really about how the federal laws that black folks were supposed to be protected in the old Confederate states were not really being enacted. Now, I tell you some things that we all know this because most of us have been here a little while, and we know what segregation was. Segregation was in restaurants, was in schools, was in transportation, was in housing, was in jobs. It was in everything, even going to the park. It was segregation. You know, I don't know if you guys ever had the opportunity to see the whites only signs, but I did because I was born in Mississippi and I was born in Mississippi in the 1950s, and I did not leave Mississippi until 1970. So as a boy growing up, when I would go to the towns and the little, they really wasn't no big cities, but the little stores and the little places where we could go, and you'd see these fountains and bathrooms that had whites only. I never forget. I remember I went to Clarksdale, Mississippi with my mother, and I had to be about 8 or 9 years old, and we were gonna go shop at Kroger or something like that. And I kept tugging on my mother, Mama, Mama, I got to go use the bathroom. I got to go use the bathroom. And, she didn't really like that because she knew what had happened. She said, Boy, there's no bathroom around here for you. I said, But Mom, I got to use the bathroom. So we went walking all around that little place until we found the bus station, the Greyhound bus station. And it had a bathroom that said black only. And I remember being a little boy, and I went in that little black only bathroom and relieved myself and came back to my mother. And I saw a door right next to it that said whites only. And there was a water fountain. There were two water fountains out there. One said black, one said white. So I saw those signs. Now, what we've just gone over is the beginning of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was brought in effect simply to disenfranchise, to keep Black people in a state of servitude and basically slavery. And for a long time, it was working. It was working. But it wasn't just working down south. Down south, Blacks had to mind their tone. Down south, Blacks had to watch where they walked. They had to watch how they talked. They had to watch where they went because every adult white person in those towns was just looking for a reason to do some harm to you, to lock you up in jail, to hit you in the head with a pipe, to catch you on a dog road at night and do something to you that they shouldn't. All because they wanted to keep you in a second class citizenship position. As long as you mind your tone, learn how to talk and act, you didn't really have a problem with those white people. But as long as you start trying to assert yourself, go to the schools, get education, get a job, what have you, get the good paying jobs I'm talking. I don't mean service jobs because they love for you to have a service job. We hear right now people complain about they're picking up illegal aliens and sending them home, and we're not going to have anybody to pick all this and pick all that. Well, when I was a boy, the people who was doing all the picking were Black people, and nobody was running around upset because we was doing the picking except
Mm.
for Black people. Anyway, we've been told by many, or a lot of people thought that Jim Crow didn't exist in the North. Okay, they say, well, it's just down south. Only the Southerners, it's only the Southerners had Jim Crow. Well, I beg to differ. African Americans who decided to immigrate to the big cities, New York, St. Louis, Chicago, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, you know, Cincinnati, Rochester, New York, all those places where right now there's a lot of Black folks living in those places because a lot of Black folks left the South. They were sick and tired of Jim Crow holding them back. They couldn't get good jobs, so they left. They migrated. That's what my family did. We left, tired of Jim Crow. We left, came to St. Louis. Well, even though most of these big cities didn't actually have laws that was mandated by their legal legislators on Jim Crow, they still had Jim Crow. Old Jim Crow was alive and well where racial segregation and discrimination still happened. The northern states made up no laws that mandated Jim Crow, but racial segregation between white and blacks was practiced in about every aspect of daily life of Black people. Instead of the state and local government creating Black laws, the private sector, the civic and commercial institutions made their own rules that state and local government tolerated. Where you hear today, you hear people say these terms like, well, there's systemic racism. There's racial institutions, racist institutions. Well, that's true. They're right. But they're nowhere near the systemic racism of the private, civic, and commercial institutions of the 1900s through the 1980s. They're nowhere near that. But they had that. So in the North, you had better economic opportunities. Okay, you left down south, you stopped picking cotton, you wasn't chopping any more cotton, you wasn't driving any more tractors, you wasn't working in no big farm no more, you wouldn't work for Mr. Charlie on his plantation. Okay, so you left Mr. Charlie's plantation, driving tractors and picking cotton, chopping cotton. picking corn and baling hay, okay, for 50 cents an hour or $2 a day or whatever they paid. You left. You came to the big city. Well, your economic outlook was better. Your opportunities was better. You had a safer environment. The Klan wasn't riding around trying to knock you in the head. But something replaced the Klan they called police officers. That replaced them. But when you got up north and you thought you had left Jim Crow down in Mississippi and Arkansas, Texas, and Georgia and Alabama, you found out that Jim Crow was in New York City, he was in Chicago, he was in St. Louis, he was in Cleveland, he was in Rochester, he was in Philadelphia, he was in DC, he was all over the place. He was right there just waiting for you to screw up. And what I mean by screw up, just be a human being and try to be a man or a woman and try to get respect. And that's when they laid the boom on you. In the big cities, they created covenants created by landowners where blacks can't live here. We're not selling homes to black folks because there goes the neighborhood if one of them come over here. So black people can come. And they had covenants that the law protected. The law said, yes, they can tell you you can't live on this side of town. They can tell you you can't go to the Fox Theater. They can tell you, no, we don't have to let you stay in the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. As a matter of fact, you can even walk across the Chase Park Plaza's parking lot without some security guard running your butt away. Okay? So that was up north. Restaurants, entertainment venues, the Kill Opera House, New York City, the Cotton Club. Okay, you had black entertainers. Everybody black think the Cotton Club was a black club. Yes, it was a black club where black folks performed entertainment, but the club was owned by white people, and black people couldn't come there to watch Cab Calloway, okay, Louis Armstrong. Black people could not go there to hear these black artists because these black artists were there for the entertainment of the white patrons. And the club was owned by white people. You could work there. You could be a busboy. You could be a tap dancer. You can be a singer, a booty shaker. You know, you could do all that stuff, but you could not go and just say, you know what? I'm
In
gonna
the
take my wife
entertainment.
out tonight and we're gonna go to the Cotton Club and sit down and just check this out. Eh, couldn't do that. Same thing at the Kill Opera House. Couldn't do that. Same thing at the Fox Theater back in the day when the Fox Theater was the biggest movie theater in St. Louis. You could not go to that theater. No, you could not. That was up here. Now, we'll just take St. Louis for example. In the early 1900s, restrictive social policies and poor economic conditions relegated black people to high poverty neighborhoods. In other words, Mill Creek Valley and the Ville were poverty-stricken neighborhoods. I don't know if you guys know what the Ville consisted of, but the Ville went all the way from uh, Grand all the way to Market Street. It was huge. And all the stuff that are there now basically wasn't really there then. Okay. They kicked the black folks out and revitalized and turned it into what it is today. Okay. Now, parents was forced to enroll their kids in inferior schools. Okay. And they were substandard. Because I know, like you guys, I went to segregated schools. Okay. Even though Plessy, the Board of Education had passed the rules, the Supreme Court has said black kids to go to school with white kids. I didn't go to school with white kids until I went to college. And I was a grown man then. All my 12 years of primary school and high school, I went to school with black kids. And I'm sure a lot of you did the exact same thing. So the schools were, and I remember those days, the schools were inferior. I remember the books that I would have. Somebody had those books years ago, their names. You look in the binder, you see all the different kids who had signed their names when they had that very same book. I never had any new books until I bought them when I went to college. That's when I had new books. I bought them when I went to college. Other than that, I'm just using myself as an example because there was millions of us who did the exact same thing. But now, when black parents in St. Louis was restricted from putting their kids in good schools, that mean if they had to put their kids in the schools that was in the poor black neighborhood, that limited where they could work because you there was no such thing as no busing. Your kids went to the neighborhood school. So you had to live in the neighborhood for your kid to go to that school. In other words, you couldn't live in the Central West End and send your kid to the schools on Wales and Goodfellow. You just wasn't going to happen. By them being limited, that limited their opportunities for jobs. Because see, the city of St. Louis back in those days was an industrial hub and employed thousands of people. But black people were lucky at best to be hired by these companies, but most of them were not because Jim Crow kept them from being hired. We don't hire black people. When I first started working for Ameren, Ameren was called Union Electric. I talked to older men at that time. I was 22 years old. These older guys in their 40s and 50s. So you know how old they were, and you know where they come from. They told me that because I would ask, why are you doing this? Why are you still doing this menial job? Why are that job doesn't pay as much. I'm making more money than you, and I just started working here 3 months ago. Why haven't you go for that particular job? Because one of them told me, well, I wanted a job like that, but when I tried when I was a young man, they told me they didn't hire no ends for that job. And he said, I got old doing this job, and now I have to go to school to get it now, and I'm too old to try to go to school. So I'm just to be satisfied with the job I have now. I heard that if one time, 100 times from different black men who were older men, who were my elders, who had served in World War II. That's what they were told. Now, that was just one company. There was many other companies that did the exact same thing. The ones who got hired, like the man I'm talking about, they got hired by these companies, but they had limited success. They would get hired and they would work on the dock, or they'd become a laborer, or they would become a window washer, or they would become a floor sweeper. But at the company that I worked for, the big jobs were the jobs where the guys did all the hard work, where they did the technical type stuff. Okay? You know, that was an electrical company, and you had to get electrical skills. So if you got electrical skills, you made the big dollars. And then you could move into management if you so chose to do that. Well, that wasn't happening at my company until I got to be in my middle 30s. Then they started moving black men into those positions because times was changing. Old Jim Crow was disappearing. Now, we all know Jim Crow had his birth in the South. That's true. Born in the South, but he spread his ugly head across his entire country like a wildfire. The unequal policies had African Americans down for decades. And you know what? Some of the effects of Jim Crow are still felt today. They really are, because everybody who lived through Jim Crow are not gone. A lot of us are still here. Jim Crow became the personification of the system that encouraged racial oppression and segregation within this country, a system that was allowed and approved by the government. Jim Crow laws existed in this country for a long time. It was mandated segregation in public facilities, jobs, schools. You know, we came up, the Supreme Court came up with this separate but equal stuff, which we know was just a bunch of crap. It wasn't equal. It was separate, but it wasn't equal. In reality, this led to a treatment of usually inferior everything. Everything that we had to deal with, or our people had to deal with, or black people had to deal with, was inferior to that the majority of whites had to deal with. Now, you know, you guys hear this all the time. I know you hear it if you pay attention to the news media. White people got white privilege. White folks got white privilege. Well, thank Jim Crow for white people having white privilege. The reason Jim Crow kept you back so they could have the privilege to be the first hired, to be the one to go to the good colleges, the one to get the good jobs, and kept you back. So when we did start getting those new good jobs, they were 10 miles ahead of us. And they would be the first one considered for whatever, not you. And no matter how you changed your vernacular, your speech pattern, straighten your hair, try to act like them, you were never going to be them. And you're never going to get white privilege. No matter how much you complain about it, they have it, they're going to keep it, and they would be a bunch of fools if they gave it up. Now, we just discussed the birth and the plight of Jim Crow. Now we're going to talk about the death of Jim Crow. Because, see, Jim Crow did die. Trust me, Jim Crow died. You know, the sun was about to set on the Jim Crow laws. When African American men started returning from World War II, and they decided, you know, I've been all over the world fighting for this country, and I am now going to be treated like a man. I am not going to let these people push me around anymore. So when they try pushing me around, we're going to fight back one way or the other. And some fought physically because they had a lot of rides and things in big cities, white and black rides. But most of the ones that helped move and shake Jim Crow out from around our necks were the black community civil rights activists and the civil rights leaders. They were the warriors. They ensured that black people got the right to vote because, see, even though black people had the right to vote, many black people were not voting because Jim Crow was keeping black people from voting in the South. And the black people in the North just wouldn't simply go to the polls and just vote in large numbers. But these civil rights people ensured that, look, you need to get out and vote. You need to vote somebody in that's thinking about us, thinking about helping us. Make a move. The only way Jim Crow is going to die is if black people fight for their rights. And that was what black people began to do. They began to focus on ensuring black citizens were able to vote. This legislation, once you got some black congressmen in positions, once you got some white congressmen in position who want to help black people, you got some action. We had decade after decade of protests. Please don't think that the civil rights movement started just in the 1950s because it started long before then. But when we had decades of protests and legal battles, black men and women were beaten, some was killed. The civil rights movement marched on and on and on. And Jim Crow laws were about to see the light of day for the very last time. Civil rights activists like A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, Ralph Bunche, even Jesse Jackson were instrumental in ensuring the rights for all African Americans. Dr. King became his most visible spokesperson and leader in his efforts to end segregation, racism, and Jim Crow. Now, I want to say something about Dr. King. To show you how Dr. King, A. Philip Randolph, Ralph Abernathy, Ralph Bunche, and Jesse Jackson was so different from the leaders that we have today. The leaders that we have today, called the Black Caucus, congressmen in Washington, D.C., they refuse to talk to this president that we have today. Why do they refuse? Because he's a racist. He's a racist. And they refuse to talk to him to help the blacks that are hurting right now. Dr. King, did you think that the presidents that Dr. King talked to were not racist? I mean, did you think that the people, the white folks that Rap Abernathy and Philip A. Randolph and Jesse Jackson, you think all these white folks that they was talking to about helping black people, you think they wasn't racist? You think he didn't have to go into the den of racist folks to try to get something done? Well, he did. And he talked to any man to help his people, whether he was racist or not. He figured if I can talk to you, I might be able to change your racist mind, which he did. Because I'm going to tell you guys something. Segregation laws began to fall one after the other. We started winning court battles. We got Thurgood Marshall as a big time lawyer. He won big cases. He desegregated the schools with his case. And before you know it, Dr. King was talking to Eisenhower. And he was talking to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy got killed. Then he started talking to Johnson. Okay? Now, President Johnson, was one of those Dixiecrat Democrats who was a racist to his heart. But you know who killed Jim Crow at the behest of Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights marches? It wasn't John F. Kennedy. He didn't live long enough to do it. It was Lyndon Johnson. He signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. Once those laws were signed and put into law, Jim Crow was dead on arrival. But I'm going to tell you something. Most of the Democrats tried to filibuster the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They didn't even want it to pass. They wanted to, I mean, that Strom Thurmond, he stood his butt up there and filibustered for almost a day trying to keep those laws from passing or black folks. Because see, what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did, no discrimination toward black people, nowhere, in everything. No more discrimination, period. And then the next one was the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act came up in 65. Although black folks had the right to vote, well, it wasn't against the law for these people to try to come up with all kind of things to make it hard for you to vote. You know, most black folks wasn't that educated prior to 1965, especially in the South. So they would come up with all these literacy tests and count the peanuts in the jar and how many pickles in the jar and all that stuff. To if you couldn't tell them, then you couldn't vote. Okay, that was Jim Crow, and that's what the Voting Rights Act came up with. It came up with, no, you cannot ask an American citizen to take any type of test. He's an American citizen. He has the right to vote, whether he has a high school diploma or he went to the first grade. And that's what that Voting Rights Act did. These segregation laws began to fall due to court actions brought on by the black leaders. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus Brown education that educational segregation was unconstitutional. That's the case Thurgood Marshall won. 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal to discriminate based on race, gender, color, religion, and national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 made it illegal to discriminate against people who wanted to vote. The combination of these major national laws led to the death. And when I say death, I mean the death of Jim Crow. African Americans across the country celebrated by having mock funerals. They walked up and down the street protesting with mock funerals of caskets with a dead Jim Crow in it. They were happy. And they won the day. See, what we have to understand as a people, we have come a long way. We went through our wilderness and we are still here. No matter what they threw at us, we are still here. And that's a fact. Now, I'm going to throw out a couple of points to remember, then I'm going to get to some questions. Like I had told you before, first point, Democratic people, Democrat politicians of mainly the South were responsible for coming up with the Jim Crow laws. They came with all kind of legislation to make it impossible for us to even have a good life. They called them Dixiecrats. But there's one thing, the Democrats began to change because the Northern Democrats started participating in the civil rights activism. And Dr. Martin Luther King changed the mind of Johnson, and he signed the legislation and made all that Jim Crow era crap go away. The parties changed. The parties changed. A lot of those Democrats that were racist dogs didn't want black folks to have rights. They started leaving the Democratic Party when Johnson did what he did, and they went to the Republican Party. They thought they was doing something. And then the Republican Party started being dominated by those Democrats who didn't have any good things to say about black people. So that was their strategy. That was what they did. And that's how they got away with getting out of the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party started changing and started taking up the causes of black people. And they take up the cause of black people so much now until they just take black people for granted. They think black people should just vote for them regardless, whether they doing anything for them or not. But any other facts, I have plenty of facts. And I want to ask you guys, do you have any questions before I start going over all these facts? Are there any questions?
Brother Robinson, I do have a question. My hand is up. You may not have seen it.
I see it.
Okay. Uh, can I go ahead and proceed with my question?
Yes, ma'am.
It's interesting you talked about Strom Thurmond, but it's not oftentimes mentioned that he had a baby by a black woman, didn't he?
Yeah, but she was a
Just
servant.
like him.
Yep, she was a servant, and he, she was a servant, and white men, whether they was racist or not, they always liked black women.
Thank you for answering my question.
Yes, he did. The question comes up a lot about, are we still living in Jim Crow today? And I'm going to tell you straight out, unequivocally, no. We're not living in Jim Crow today. Some of us have confused the systemic racism that still exists in our institutions and the racism that some of our politicians throw out as confusing that with Jim Crow. That's not Jim Crow. That's racism. And you're not going to stop a person's emotional reaction to you. If they don't like us, we're not going to make them like us. But as long as the law is on our side, then they're not going to be able to put us back in Jim Crow. And as long as we ensure that they don't put us back in Jim Crow by voting like when you should, you won't have that problem. I mean, we have to stop being confused. We are confused in a way where We like to take up the plight of everybody, but we should worry about the plight of African Americans. Because when African Americans were striving and fighting and being murdered and hung and killed by the racist segregationists and white supremacists, nobody was coming to our defense of any other color, of any other race, from any other country. None of them. But now, when something happens in this country today, we want to say, well, they only doing that to them people because they brown. Well, those brown people was here before, but they weren't helping us. So why, I understand the good Christian thing is to don't want nobody to be hurt. That's my thing. I don't want nobody to be hurt. But I want people to follow our laws. Because I got to follow our laws. Because if I don't follow our laws, they're gonna lock me up. Just like, so they need to follow the laws too, regardless if they're brown or yellow. There's one thing I do want to say though. Do you know another fact I want to tell you so you'll know you weren't living in Jim Crow? In 1960, that was during the Jim Crow era. 1960, the median income for a black family was $1,869 a year. Before you say that's nothing, that was the equivalent of $17,500 today. You had the spending power of if you had $17,500 a day. However, $17,500 can't buy you anything today. And $1,869 wasn't buying very much then. Well, we're going to fast forward to now. The median income for an African American family today, in today's dollars, is $56,490. Now that means some people make less, some make more. But $56,000, a family of four should be able to live pretty fair. Pretty fair. So in other words, you see, we made a gain. That's a gain from 1960. Another gain we made. During the Jim Crow era, we had a handful of millionaires, a handful of black millionaires. You can name them. Madam C.J. Walker, Booker T. Washington, maybe Louis Armstrong and Scott Joplin. There were others, but not very many. Well, today, right now, in America, we have over 1 million black millionaires, and we have a bunch of black billionaires. So you can't say Jim Crow is happening today if you got all those well-to-do black people. Okay? So it's not happening today. What's happening today is white supremacy is raising its ugly head, and systemic racism is still a problem in lots of places where you try to go get jobs. That's the HR manager's fault. It's not a lot you can do about that. All you can do is what you're supposed to do. That's it. Are there any questions?
Lee, I don't have a question. I kind of have a comment.
Comment away, sister.
You talked about the Ville neighborhood and how it was back then, but I think with the storm when it came through, it hit a lot of the Ville neighborhoods, and a lot of people were living in second and third generation homes where they didn't have titles and stuff that were transferred to their names, and the houses are just in ruins now. I guess the problem that I see is, we don't always take care of the business like we should, but a lot of those homes are going to go eventually too back to the city because nobody has deeds, And it's only because of people not taking care of business. And I think even what you talked about with the Jim Crow, we still need people to share with other people what they need to do to take care of business so that they won't have their homes lost. Because some of them they won't have anything. They may move them somewhere else, but their homes are gone because grandmama, great grandmama left it to them, and then they somebody else lived in it and somebody else lived in it, and now the house is in ruin. So I think we still have a long way to go with teaching our people.
And you know what, Regina? You're 100% correct because I've said this for years and I'll never stop saying it. Black people are their own worst enemies. They don't realize it, but they are because of ignorance.
Hmm.
We're ignorant to the fact that if grandma leaves you a house, you need to take that deed and get it transferred into your name and
Hmm.
start paying your taxes under your name.
Hmm.
You know, there are so many things that African Americans need to learn and do to take care of their business, but they don't want to tell you their business. So you don't know. They won't tell you that this house I'm living in isn't in my name. They won't tell you. So you don't really know how to, you could go to the library. I remember in the 1990s, I used to do presentations at the library. I used to go to Julius Davis Library and the Walnut Park Library, the Lewis and Clark Library. And me and a couple other fellows, we would hold all sorts of programs on trying to help black people do things. One or two will show up, three or four show up. We used to advertise it in the black media, the St. Louis American, Tom Joyner show, and all that stuff. It would be on that we gonna have these meetings. They wouldn't show up. They wouldn't show up. We had one show to teach young boys, young men, how to fill out an application for a job because most of them didn't know how to do it. One or two of them show up. And see, I agree with everything you're saying. That it's sad and I hate it, but I don't know what else to do because our black politicians are too busy sticking their hands in the cookie jar instead of trying to help what's going on in the neighborhoods. So the reverends, most of our preachers, they're too worried about going to heaven and telling you what Jesus said, but they're not doing what Jesus did.
Hmm.
And so that's a hard one. That's a
Yeah.
hard one.
And I think that's the other reason why people are still in the brick and mortars that have come down and fallen all over them because they know once they leave, they have no recourse. They have
They
no
got nowhere to go.
so and then their homes are gone. So it's kind of it's a horrible thing, but maybe, again, we can start teaching our children and our children's children,
Yeah,
when you have a piece of land, you need to take care of it. I have a situation
yeah.
real close over here that a house was left to a young man and he's losing it because of taxes. So, you can only do what you can do. But thank you.
And there were a lot of the homes in the city area there that was destroyed by the tornado. Uh, the people had just let the insurance go. And they don't understand, even if you did have insurance, they didn't was not going to want to give you the total cost of rebuilding that house, but they was going to give you something. Well, if you don't have any insurance, you get nothing. And you're dependent on FEMA and all those organizations. Those organizations are not really there to rebuild your house. That's what people think. They're not there. They're there to ease the pain while you are trying to get your stuff together. But like I said, that's a hard thing. It's one of those things. It's hard to teach people when they don't want to learn. No, we can try, but they don't. A lot of them don't want to learn. We can come up with all kind of seminars and helpful suggestions that we can post and put together for them, but only a handful show up. So it's just it's far beyond me to come up with exactly what to do because I really don't know what to do. I really don't. But I do know that Jim Crow held us back very much. And I do know Jim Crow is basically dead. And what African Americans should hang their hats on nowadays is that white supremacy and white racists and white racism and segregationists and all those type of people from 1866 until 2025, they have thrown everything that they could possibly think of to deter us from being successful. And we have, for the most part, jumped over all of that racism and segregation and separatists and racism and succeeded. In other words, there's no stopping us. Yes, we have our section of our population that's need help and don't seem to be moving forward, but we also have that segment of our population that is moving by leaps and bounds, that are doing well, that are teaching their children well, that are living well. So Jim Crow is dead. It's not Jim Crow that's stopping us now. Most of the times, it's us stopping us now. It's not so much, it's like you think about this, and I say this all the time. In the city of St. Louis, I'm sure it's the same way in other cities, but in the city of St. Louis on the black side of town, the Klan is not killing black people. It's black people who are killing black people. The Klan is not robbing you. It's black people who are robbing you. The Klan is not carjacking you and taking your cars. It's black people who are doing that. So we need to arrest that problem in our community before we blame everything on racism. Because everything that happens to our people isn't racism, although I can understand a lot of these young men are seeing the effect, are still feeling the effect of the racism that their parents went through, and their parents didn't teach them the proper way to deal with it. So they're acting in a way that they don't understand what they're doing. Before I go, I want to say this. I want to say this because I'm going to be on a hiatus until February. And so this will be the last one for this year. So I want to say this because I want to make an impression upon you guys about one thing. You also hear the term slave mentality used a lot. I know you guys have heard it. Well, the slave mentality that I see is African Americans calling each other nigger. Excuse me for saying the word, but that's a slave mentality. The white supremacist, racist slave owner invented that word for something low down, dirty, nasty, and trifling. And he convinced the slaves that that's what he was. The slaves started using it toward each other. And after slavery, they taught it to their free children, and their free children have taught it to their grandchildren, great grandchildren, and we still use it today to describe each other. That is a direct link to a slave mentality when you call yourself what the overseers and the slave owners call you in a derogatory manner. I just want to get that out. So maybe you guys could pass it on to somebody you know. That word is nothing new. That word has been around since about 1716. And it was designed to make you feel inferior, to make you think you was inferior, to make you think you are not a human. And when black people say that to each other, no matter how, whatever excuse they give you why they use it, what they're still saying is that you are low down, dirty, trifling, and no good. That's still what they're saying.
Mr. Lee, I want you spoke about the Ville area being from Grand to Market. Now, where Sumner and Annie Malone are, they call it the Greater Ville, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
no, the Ville wasn't from Grand to Market. That was Mill Creek Valley. The Greater Ville was exactly what you're talking about. It was over there from Natchez Bridge that went all the way over to Easton and there's some
Vandervenner.
other streets, but it was the Greater Ville.
it was the Greater Ville, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me, okay, another thing, you talked about the Fox being the white theater right across. I remember going to the Lowe's, and I
Yeah.
wasn't like, yeah, and the Lowe's was the only place we could go at that time. My mother said that the Fox was segregated, and the only place black people were allowed to go was the Lowe's. That was right across the street from the Fox. You remember that?
Yeah, but there were other theaters in St. Louis that was all black theaters.
The
You
Comet,
could have went
yeah,
to
yeah.
Comet, and
Hmm.
no, it was I can't think of the name of it now, but it was another one started with an M down on Franklin. I just can't think of the name of it now.
Okay,
But yeah, you're right.
thank you.
Hmm. Well, I've enjoyed the series of
Sure.
lessons, and I've enjoyed having my loyal listeners listen to me. And I hope next year we can do the exact same thing. I hope we can get more of the male population of the Third Presbyterian Church to listen next time. I'm going to talk to them when our very next men's meeting. I'm going to impress upon them as much as I can that they need to listen because they can learn something too. They're
You got
men.
another
They don't
hand
know
up.
everything.
You got another hand up.
Yeah. Yo, where hand at? Go ahead, Corey. Corey?
Brother Robinson, it certainly has been a privilege to have sat in on your presentations. Very informative. I've learned a lot of things that I didn't know. And so we're grateful that you take the time to educate us. I thought I knew something about Black history, but every time I sit in on one of your discussions, I realize that there are so many things that I don't know.
Yeah,
But I
you
do
knew a lot.
want to entertain, if I may, or just address what you said regarding Black people being our own worst enemy. And I agree with that to a certain degree. But then I do believe that there is some hidden racism that is a part of that as well. For example, I only know of one Black rapper, and I may be mistaken, but one that I know that's prominent and well known that doesn't degrade women, doesn't curse, doesn't call each other the N word, and all that kind of stuff. That's common. But when those young Black boys go to rap, the music executives, who happen to be white people for the most part, there may be a few Black producers and promoters, but basically that's dominated by white men. They will
True.
publish all of the rap that degrades Black women, uses the N word, uses the MF word, and any other word you can think of. And they get promoted, they get contracts, their music is played, and they have become millionaires, degrading not only themselves, but Black folks too. But they're being bankrolled by the white executives. And so they are the ones that are in control of producing music for the most part. You have a few Black producers, um, but basically they control what gets produced, how it's promoted, and they make millionaires out of those young Black men that denigrate not only themselves, but particularly Black women as well. So that to me, that's perpetuating the denigration of Black folk, and it's still being controlled by the white man. So, to a certain degree, he might be a modern day master, in my opinion, the slave man, because he's still dictating. He's not beating them, he's not raping women, he's not doing things of that nature, all the atrocities that but he's still controlling the narrative of the Black life. And that narrative is also keeping us oppressed, just in a different way.
Well, you know what, Corey? I 150% agree with you in that situation. You're totally 100% right. When I'm saying those are not the ones I'm saying are their own worst enemies. That these guys are being manipulated and used by whites. They really are, and you're 100% right. The whip their masters using is money, and that's what's getting them to do what they want. So you are right.
Absolutely.
You're 100% right. I can't debate that in no negative way. You're totally correct.
Thank you for allowing me to speak, sir. And
No
again,
problem.
thank you for all that you've educated us on over these past couple of months, and we're looking forward to 2026.
All right. Thank you, guys.